Okay, so um, so to sort of recap, well, we've been talking about computing these expected values, and this is how, according to economists, this is how you ought to handle an uncertain situation, right? If you have some situation where you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you have some idea of what the probabilities are, well, then you can calculate the expected value of that situation and then make a decision as to whether you want to go with it or not. But there are some situations which appear to present a problem, or which appear to even present a paradox for this strategy of using or maximizing the expected value. And we're going to talk about two of these situations. The first is a situation having to do with risk preference, and the second is something called the St. Petersburg paradox. And what we'll see is that these two situations, they present a problem for expected value. However, we can resolve the problem, we can sort of resolve the paradox if we look at a closely related concept. If we assume that we ought to maximize not expected value, but something called expected utility. Okay, so let's have a look at this game. Okay, so very simple game. All we're going to do is we're going to flip a coin. Okay, so flip a coin. If it comes up heads, you lose $100. I'm sorry, you win $100. And if it comes up tails, you get nothing. So what's the expected value of this game? So, okay, well, let's calculate the expected value of this game. So go back to my initial calculator over here. Let me delete these probabilities. Okay, so we could either win the game, so we could come up heads, okay, in which case I would be paid $100. What's the probability of that? It's 1 out of 2. It could come up tails, in which case I would get nothing. And of course, there's a 50% chance of that happening. Okay, so the expected value of this game, not surprisingly, is $50. Okay, so now, here's my question. Suppose I give you the choice of either playing this game or of getting $50 for sure. Okay, so you could play in this game where you could either get 0 or 100 with 50-50 odds, or I could just give you $50 for sure. Okay, what would you rather do? And if you are like the vast majority of people, okay, and you're presented with this choice, you are going to pick the $50 for sure. Okay, not everybody, but the majority of people do. Okay, there's actually a name for this, okay, which is that this is called being risk averse. If, on the other hand, you would prefer to play the game, then you're risk loving. And if you're indifferent between the two, you're risk neutral. Okay? Now, if you follow this rule of expected value, you ought to be indifferent, right? Because the expected value of the game is 50. The expected value of the sure thing is, well, there is no expected value. It's just 50. Okay, so it's $50 either way. People, if they're maximizing expected value or using expected value to make decisions, they ought to be indifferent between these two choices. But what you find is, of course, that they're not. People have, asked people a version of this question across different cultures, across different socioeconomic classes, and you always find that the majority of people prefer to get the $50 for sure. Okay, so why is that? Well, there's a number of potential explanations for this. Okay, but one possible explanation, and one quite useful explanation, is the concept of diminishing marginal utility. Now, we haven't used this term utility yet in our class, but it is a fundamental concept in microeconomics. Okay, so utility, economists essentially assume that what people want to maximize is not necessarily happiness, but utility. Okay? And what is utility? Utility is just, the satisfaction that you kind of derive from any particular situation. Okay? And so this economist, Gosson, okay, who was sort of the first person to really formalize this idea, he was basically saying that, hey, what people care about isn't money per se, but the happiness that they derive from what they can buy with that money. And he called this satisfaction or happiness that you derive from the money, he called that utility. Okay? And so then the question is, well, how much utility do you get out of a certain amount of money? What is the relationship between the amount of money that you have and the amount of utility that you enjoy? Well, that's tantamount to asking the question, what is your utility function? And Gosson suggested that in general, people's utility function follows the law of diminishing returns. Okay. Now, we've come across the law of diminishing returns before when we talked about firms. And we said that there was diminishing returns when you consider, for example, hiring more workers. Yes, you can hire more workers and each worker will bring additional output, but as you'll remember from the activity we did in class, eventually adding more workers gets you less and less and less marginal product. Okay? And if we were to plot your production on a graph, we will find that that production has this characteristic sort of curved or bowed shape. And Gosson suggested that, people's utility as a function amount of the money that they have is also follows the same pattern. So for example, if I were to give you, $10 and you already had $10, your utility would rise by a certain amount. But if I were to give you that same $10 and you already had $70, well, then the amount of additional satisfaction you would derive wouldn't be quite as much. Okay? And I think this kind of makes sense, right? Like, if you don't have a lot of money, right? If you're poor and I decide to give you some money, I give you, everybody is about to get these coronavirus checks apparently, right? Signed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump gives you $1,000 and you're poor, you're like, hey, all right, that's a pretty good amount of money. On the other hand, if you're already rich, say you're Bill Gates, getting $1,000 isn't really going to amount for anything, right? So, okay. So what we're going to basically assume then is that people's utility functions, they follow the law of diminishing returns, and we're going to assume that we're going to use that fact when we do these calculations. Okay, when we do these expected value calculations. Now, by the way, you might be thinking to yourself, is there any actual empirical evidence of this? And actually, people have done a number of studies. Okay, and what you find is that generally speaking, okay, it does appear that, if you ask people how satisfied they are with their life as a function of their income, okay, you do see that, your sort of satisfaction begins to flatten out. It does have this shape, okay, starting around $75,000. Okay, so this is kind of potentially what this curve actually looks like. Okay, so let's I have the calculation on this slide, but actually let's just do it in our expected value calculator. Okay, so actually this is a good stopping point. I'm going to show you how to do this calculation in the next video.